So it looks like we are live. Alright. So, first of all, apologies for last week. Uh, uh, so there is a backstory for why there was no stream last week. And I have to apologize for the short notice. Uh, it was my brother's birthday, and we had a celebration for him. And I didn't expect it to go as late as it did, but it did. So, yeah, I ended up needing to cancel last minute. So that's why there was no stream last week. Um, but yeah, that's the reason. So this week we're going to do the reading that we were supposed to do last week. And it's a good reading. I think you guys are going to like it. It's going to be on dialectics. It's the second chapter of Engels' Utopian and Scientific. It's a follow up to the first chapter, which was on the subject of historical materialism and the development of classes in society. Um, so, as a quick refresher, Engels goes into basically the development of society from feudalism into a capitalist uh, a capitalist system of um, finance in society, and how there comes to be classes in society where you have this what he calls the bourgeois class and the proletarian class, which are in this fundamentally antagonistic position in society. As he explains, their interests are antagonistic to each other, and so that is the impetus for the concept of socialism arising in society, because there is this understanding that there is a contradiction uh, in society, where there's this class struggle where people are working and producing things in society, and there's this class of people that are what he calls idlers, people who don't really do anything, don't really do anything productive in society, and yet have this disproportionate power and influence in deciding how things get done. And uh, then, but he calls this form of socialism utopian socialism, because it knows that a better form of society is possible, and it can criticize the society that exists, but it doesn't really understand it well enough to criticize it, or to know why it's wrong, and to give reasons for what is wrong with it and how we can do better. So that's where we get into today's subject, which is dialectics, and how we can start to look at what Marx and Engels spent a lot of their time, look at the method that they used for understanding society and the means of production and history itself, and then get into how you can use that to create a scientific version of socialism, where it's not based on this just social angst of just wishing things were better, but actually knowing that things can be better on a scientific basis, on a basis of knowing that the producers of society can use the full potential of the production of society, to decide how and why society should be structured. So we'll get into that, and we'll see more of what he says as we go along. But for today, we'll focus on dialectics and what that actually means. And so let's dive in. In the meantime, along with and after the French philosophy of the 18th century had risen the new German philosophy, culminating in Hegel. Its greatest merit was the taking up again of dialectics as the highest form of reasoning. The old Greek philosophers were all born natural dialecticians, and Aristotle, the most encyclopedic of them, had already analyzed the most essential forms of dialectic thought. The newer philosophy, on the other hand, although in it also dialectics had brilliant exponents, for example Descartes, Spinoza, had, especially through English influence, become more and more rigidly fixed in the so-called metaphysical mode of reasoning, by which also the French of the 18th century were almost wholly dominated, at all events in their special philosophical work. Outside philosophy in the restricted sense, the French nevertheless produced masterpieces of dialectic. We need only call to mind Diderot's Les Neveux de Rameau and Rousseau's Discours sur l'origine et les fondements de l'ingénierie parmi les hommes. We give here, in brief, the essential character of these two modes of thought. When we consider and reflect upon nature at large, or the history of mankind, or our own intellectual activity, at first we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations in which nothing remains what were and as it was, but everything moves, changes, comes into being, and passes away. We see, therefore, at first the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combine, and are combined, or rather are connected. This primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy, and was first clearly formulated by Heraclitus. Excuse me. Everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, is constantly changing, constantly coming into being and passing away. But this conception, correctly as it expresses the general character of the picture of appearances as a whole, does not suffice to explain the details of which this picture is made up. And so long as we do not understand these, we have not a clear idea of the whole picture. In order to understand these details, we must detach them from their natural special causes, effects, etc. This is primarily the task of natural science and historical research, branches of science which the Greek of classical times, on very good grounds, relegated to a subordinate position because they had first of all to collect materials for these sciences to work upon. A certain amount of natural and historical material must be collected before there can be any critical analysis, comparison, and arrangement in classes, orders, and species. The foundations of the exact natural sciences were therefore first worked out by the Greeks of the Alexandrian period, and later on, in the Middle Ages, by the Arabs. Real natural science dates from the second half of the 15th century, and thence onward it had advanced with constantly increasing rapidity. The analysis of nature into its individual parts, the grouping of the different natural processes and objects in definite classes, the study of the internal anatomy of organized bodies in their manifold forms, these were the fundamental conditions of the gigantic strides in our knowledge of nature that have been made during the last 400 years. But this method of work has also left us as legacy the habit of observing natural objects and processes in isolation, apart from their connection with the vast whole, of observing them in repose, not in motion, as constraints, not as essentially variables in their depth, or rather in their death, not in their life. And when this way of looking at things was transferred by Bacon and Locke from natural science to philosophy, it begot the narrow metaphysical mode of thought peculiar to the last century. To the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation, fixed, rigid, given once for all. He thinks is in absolutely irreconcilable antitheses. His communication is yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot be at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in a rigid antithesis one to the other. At first sight, this mode of thinking seems to us very luminous, because it is that of so-called sound common sense. Only sound common sense, respectable fellow that he is, in the homely realm of his own four walls, has very wonderful adventures directly he ventures out into the wide world of research, and the metaphysical mode of thought, justifiable and necessary as it is in a number of domains whose extent varies according to the nature of the particular object of investigation, sooner or later reaches a limit, beyond which it becomes one-sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradictions. In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and end of that existence, of their repose. It forgets their motion. It cannot see the woods for the trees. For everyday purposes, we know and can say, for example, whether an animal is alive or not. But upon closer inquiry, we find that this is, in many cases, a very complex question, as the jurists know very well. They have cudgeled their brains in vain to discover a rational limit beyond which the killing of the child in its mother's womb is murder. It is just as impossible to determine absolutely the moment of death, for physiology proves that death is not an instantaneous, momentary phenomenon, but a very protracted process. In like manner, every organized being is every moment the same and not the same. Every moment it assimilates matter supplied from without and gets rid of other matter. Every moment some cells of its body die and others build themselves anew. In a longer or shorter time, the matter of its body is completely renewed and is replaced by other molecules of matter, so that every organized being is always itself and yet something other than itself. Further, we find upon closer investigation that the two poles of an antithesis, positive and negative, for example, are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that despite all their opposition, they mutually interpenetrate. And we find, in like manner, that cause and effect are conceptions which only hold good in their application to individual cases, but as soon as we consider the individual cases in their general connection with the universe as a whole, they run into each other, and they become confounded when we contemplate that universal action and reaction in which causes and effects are eternally changing places, so that what is effect here and now will be cause there and then, and vice versa. None of these processes and modes of thought enter into the framework of metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. Such processes as these mentioned above are, therefore, so many corroborations of its own method of procedure. Nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials increasingly daily, and thus has shown that, in the last resort, nature works dialectically, and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring circle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself, are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. But the naturalists who have learned to think dialectically are few and far between, and this conflict of the results of discovery with preconceived modes of thinking explains the endless confusion now reigning in theoretical natural science, the despair of teachers as well as learners, of authors and readers alike. An exact representation of the universe, of its evolution, of the development of mankind, and the reflection of the evolution of the minds of men can therefore only be obtained by the methods of dialectics, with its constant regard to the innumerable actions and reactions of life and death, of progressive or retrogressive changes. And in this spirit, the new German philosophy has worked. Kant began his career by resolving the stable solar system of Newton and its eternal duration, after the famous initial impulse had once been given into the result of a historical process, the formation of the sun and all the planets out of a rotating nebulous mass. From this, he at the same time drew the conclusion that given the origin of the solar system, its future death followed of necessity. His theory, half a century later, was established mathematically by Laplace. Half a century after that, the spectroscope proved the existence in space of such incandescent masses of gas in various stages of condensation. This new German philosophy culminated in the Hegelian system. In this system, herein is its great merit. For the first time, the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process, i.e., as in constant motion, changes, transformation, development, and the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development. From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild whirl of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man himself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process through all its devious ways, and to trace out the inner law running through all its apparently accidental phenomena. That the Hegelian system did not solve the problem it propounded is here immaterial. Its epoch-making merit was that it propounded the problem. This problem is one that no single individual will ever be able to solve. Although Hegel was, with Saint Simon, the most encyclopedic man of his time, yet he was limited first by the necessary limited extent of his own knowledge, and second by the limited extent and depth of the knowledge and conceptions of his age. To these limits, a third must be added. Hegel was an idealist. To him, the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things and their evolution were only the realized pictures of the idea, existing somewhere from eternity before the world was. This way of thinking turned everything upside down and completely reversed the actual connection of things in the world. Correctly and ingeniously, as many groups of facts were grasped by Hegel, yet for the reasons just given, there is much that is botched, artificial, labored, in a word, wrong, in point of detail. The Hegelian system in itself was a colossal miscarriage, but it was also the last of its kind. It was suffering, in fact, from an internal and incurable contradiction. Upon the one hand, its essential proposition was the conception that human history is a process of evolution, which, by its very nature, cannot find its intellectual final term in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth. But, on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. A system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything, and final for all time, is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectical reasoning. This law, indeed, by no means excludes, but on the contrary, includes the idea that the systematic knowledge of the external universe can make giant strides from age to age. The perception of the fundamental contradiction in German idealism led necessarily back to materialism. But, nota bene, not to the simply metaphysical, exclusively mechanical materialism of the 18th century. Old materialism looked upon all previous history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence. Modern materialism sees in it the process of evolution of humanity and aims at discovering the laws thereof. With the French of the 18th century, and even with Hegel, the conception obtained of nature as a whole, moving in narrow circles and forever immutable, with its eternal celestial bodies as Newton and unalterable organic species as Linnaeus taught. Modern materialism embraces the more recent discoveries of natural science, according to which nature also has its history and time. The celestial bodies, like the organic species that, under favorable conditions, people them, being born and perishing. And even in nature, as a whole, must still be said to move in recurrent cycles. These cycles assume infinitely larger dimensions. In both aspects, modern materialism is essentially dialectic, and no longer requires the assistance of that sort of philosophy which, queen-like, pretended to rule the remaining mob of sciences. As soon as special science is bound to make clear its position in the great totality of things and of our knowledge of things, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous or unnecessary. That which still survives of all earlier philosophy is the science of thought and its law, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is subsumed in the positive science of nature and history. Whilst, however, the revolution in the conception of nature could only be made in proportion to the corresponding positive materials furnished by research, already much earlier certain historical facts had occurred which led to a decisive change in the conception of history. In 1831, the first working class rising took place in Lyons. Between 1838 and 1842, the first national working class movement, that of the English Chartists, reached its height. The class struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie came to the front in the history of the most advanced countries in Europe. in proportion to the development, upon the one hand, of modern industry, upon the other, of the newly acquired political supremacy of the bourgeoisie. Facts more and more strenuously gave the lie to the teachings of bourgeois economy as to the identity of the interests of capital and labor, as to the universal harmony and universal prosperity that would be the consequence of unbridled competition. All these things could no longer be ignored any more than the French and English socialism, which was their theoretical, though very imperfect, expression. But the old idealist conception of history, which was not yet dislodged, knew nothing of class struggles based upon economic interests, knew nothing of economic interests. Production and all economic relations appeared in it only as incidental, subordinate elements of the history of civilization. The new facts made imperative a new examination of all past history. Then it was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles. That these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and of exchange, in a word, of the economic conditions of their time, and the economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis, starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institutions, as well as the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period. Hegel has freed history from metaphysics. He made it dialectic, but his conception of history was essentially idealistic. But now idealism was driven from its last refuge. The philosophy of history, now a materialistic treatment of history, was propounded, and a method found of explaining man's knowing by his being, instead of, as hitherto, his being by his knowing. From that time forward, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Its task was no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historico-economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. But the socialism of earlier days was as incompatible with the materialist conception as the conception of nature of the French materialist was with the dialectics of modern natural science. The socialism of earlier days certainly criticized the existing capitalist mode of production and its consequences, but it could not explain them, and therefore could not get the mastery of them. It could only simply reject them as bad. The more strongly this earlier socialism denounced the exploitations of the working class, inevitable under capitalism, the less able was it clearly to show in what this exploitation consisted and how it arose. But for this it was necessary to present the capitalist mode of production in its historical connection and its inevitableness during a particular historical period, and therefore also to present its inevitable downfall, and to lay bare its essential character, which was still a secret. This was done by the discovery of surplus value. It was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of the capitalist mode of production, and the exploitation of the worker that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of the laborer at its full value as a commodity on the market, he yet extracts more value from it than he paid for, and that in the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms those sums of value from which are heaped up constantly increasing masses of capital in the hands of the possessing classes. The genesis of capitalist production and the production of capital were both explained. These two great discoveries, the materialist conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. The next thing was to work out all its details and relations. And that's the end of the chapter. Next is the third chapter on historical materialism, but we'll save that for next week. I'll leave the stream up for another minute or so to see if anyone has any questions, and yeah, that's pretty much it. The nature of dialectics. I am a huge fan of the concept of dialectics and dialectical materialism. In fact, I think it's one of the more important concepts in Marxism and Marxist theory. I think it really grounds the philosophy and the ideology in concrete terms, and makes it something that is more than it's more than simply. So he kind of goes into this concept of idealism, and he only touches on it briefly, but I'll expand on it a bit. So idealism is this idea, or this concept of like ideas being the starting point for reality. It's this conceptualization of the world where kind of like, I mean, if you're familiar with philosophy, the philosophy of Descartes, at its core, comes down to I think, therefore I am, meaning that I can prove and justify my existence because I can think, because of the fact that I am a thinking and lucid being. That in and of itself proves to me that I am a person. And there's some validity to that. I mean, if you were blind, deaf, and had lost most of your senses, that would be about as much as you could really use to reason through existence. I mean, if you could still move around and stuff, then you'd have to figure out a lot, but it would be much harder to navigate the world. But on a philosophical level, a lot would ride on the conceptual and what you're able to reason through. Like there's a bunch in Descartes' writings of like philosophical musings of like, well, what if your senses are deceived and stuff like that. But the bottom line is that you can argue that, but in terms of understanding reality, that's not really helpful. That doesn't really get us anywhere, because the basis on which we have to operate is that our senses are correct, that what we see is true, that what we feel is true, that the natural world does exist, and that physical reality is basically exists. Like, the whole point of materialism, the whole concept of materialism, is that what exists is the physical world. Material reality is our starting point. We know that material reality exists because it is self-evident, because we are here, because even our consciousness is a product of physical processes that are going on in our brain. And now with modern science, we can explain much of that. Even the electrical impulses that are going on in our brain are physical processes that we can understand, and we're still continuing to try to understand many of them. But for much of that, we understand that it's very much physical processes that are going on. It's not like you can think of a ham sandwich and then suddenly a ham sandwich appears. That's not how the world works. You have to literally make your sandwich, otherwise you're not going to have your sandwich. And that is the point of materialism. It starts on that fundamental premise that physical reality has to be your starting point. And unless you accept that, unless you're grounded in that firmly, then you basically can't move. And then you get into dialectics, which like we just explained, you have to look at things as being dynamic. You can't look at things as though they're static and unmoving, which even today, even science today, as a scientist, I have to admit that I am sometimes frustrated with how much of modern science is still hindered by this way of thinking. But when you look at much of the most recent major advances, or the major advances in many fields of science, they are through dialectical reasoning, like the theory of relativity. It is relativity is a dialectically reasoned way of looking at physics. It is fundamentally looking at motion through a lens of dialectics. And it looks at something and says, you have to take into account the forces at work and the frame of reference and the fact that it is moving. Unless you take into account the fact that it is experiencing changes, your calculations will be wrong. And he was right. Einstein was right. We know that for a fact now. And I expect that there are probably many roadblocks right now in science that are in large part due to the fact that we just don't train scientists to think dialectically. And that will continue to be a major setback or a major hindrance to the advancement of science until we live in a post-capitalist society, until we live in a society that is able to train scientists that can think dialectically. Humans think dialectically naturally. It's part of the way that we're wired. Thinking in like putting things into boxes is in some ways unnatural, because we understand that things are fluid. We understand that things are dynamic and moving. It is the first way that we see things. To simplify things is it's a technique to understand things, but it's not it's not the way we understand the world to work. We know that that's not how things operate. So, yeah, dialectics is a very important concept to understand, especially in Marxism. And I mean, we've talked about it before. A couple of weeks back, we looked at the three components of Marxism, and that was one of the things that we talked about. And it came up again here. But I just want to stress it again because this is one of those things that, we talk a lot in Marxism about the class struggle. We talk a lot about socialism. We talk a lot about communism. We talk a lot about the state. We talk a lot about so many things. But it's important to stress these philosophical and methodological concepts and frameworks, because it's on these bases that Marxism is grounded on. And unless these concepts are used and applied, then these other concepts, like things like the class struggle, things like understanding history, things like understanding society, none of that gets done right. None of it gets done right unless you have dialectics and materialism done correctly. None of the rest will fall into place. You have to understand the philosophical and methodological groundwork in order to apply Marxism correctly. So that's why when it comes to this, to these concepts, I'm making an effort to really stress them and to try to explain them in some degree of detail and depth, so that whoever watches these videos and whoever is watching or tuning in after the fact, I want you guys to have to walk away with a degree of understanding of what these things are, so that hopefully you feel like you're getting a grasp of this, and hopefully it's something that you feel like you feel empowered to try to apply, right? Like when you look at a situation, you don't try to confine it into its subparts, and then you can apply this to the real world. These aren't things that you just read in a book and then they just go away. They are things that are applied to the real world. And I'll give you an example. Like for example, the situation in the Middle East with in Israel and Palestine. If you grew up like I did, the narrative that I was fed growing up was that it was just a religious war between people that couldn't get along, and it's always been that way for hundreds of years, thousands of years. It's just always been that way. It's too complicated, and we're just never gonna, there's nothing we can do to for them to get it right. All that is bullshit. All that is bullshit. First of all, it's not as complicated as they make it seem. You have to understand the material conditions that people are living under. And if you understand the material conditions that people are living under, then you can understand first their motivations, you can understand what they care about, and you can understand the driving forces that are influencing what they want and what they're trying to achieve. And on that basis, you can move forward and backward through time, and you can understand what people are trying to achieve, what people have been trying to achieve, where things, how the situation got to where it is, and why the conflict is the way that it is now. And you can do this, like I said, with almost anything. You have to understand that situations are dynamic, and that there are forces at play that are impacting any given circumstance, and that unless you take into account the forces at play and the unless you take into account those forces, you won't be able to understand the dynamics well enough to make a sound analysis. Um, so, to say that a a place like the Middle East is unstable, on what basis? How do you make that sort of assertion? Or that, like, to say that it's always been that way? No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't. uh, there's so much propaganda about how um, things have developed, that some of it is purposeful, some of it is just, you know it it's just easier not to look into it, um, for some people. But I think the important thing um, is to first of all take into account the fact that there there are forces at play that are influencing the way that things play out, um, and that those forces, um, you have to take into account what their motivations are, what what they want, what their interests are, and what they hope to gain. And uh, if you work backwards in terms of what has happened, what the um, history of the situation has been, uh, then you start to see why things happen the way that they did, um, and some stories are tragedies. Some stories are tragedies, um, but they don't have to continue being tragedies. That's part of why we study this stuff, so that hopefully we can make for a better future. So next week we'll do the last chapter, which is on historical materialism, and we'll get into a bit of what Engels is alluding to with surplus value, which I think we've alluded to before, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. And then, yeah, I think that'll be an interesting chapter to go through, because it starts to get into some of what scientific socialism kind of looks like, and it also starts describing capitalism in a little bit more detail that is a little more familiar to us, because it starts to look a lot more like what capitalism looks like for us, including some of the crashes that we've seen. So it'll be interesting. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you're catching this as a rerun or tuning in after the fact, then hopefully this is something that you find useful or interesting, and feel free to leave a comment or like and subscribe. But thanks again, and I'll see you next week. Have a good week.